Tonight, reactions on the attacks in Brussels, an exclusive interview from Istanbul with Talking Point's foreign correspondent Nick Papantonis, and the very latest on an anti-LGBT law passed in North Carolina. This is Talking Points. We begin with a recap of the world news of the past week. President Obama recently said that a peace deal in the Middle East during his term as president would not be possible. He also reaffirmed his support for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. The Syrian army is set to retake the key city of Palmyra from ISIS with the help of Russian airstrikes. This ancient city is known as the Bridge of the Desert and has been in ISIS hands since May of 2015. Key aid groups have continued to pull out of Greek refugee camps in boycott of the recent EU deal on refugees, saying that the deal, quote, runs roughshod over human rights. In a covert mission, 19 Yemeni Jews have flown to Israel to escape the conflict there. However, around 50 Jews chose to stay in the country. The 2022 World Cup in Qatar will be held in Bedouin-style tents and cruise ships near event stadiums in an attempt to, quote, showcase the hospitality and friendship of the Middle East. And following the recent terrorist attacks in Brussels, the Polish Prime Minister Beata Szydło said his country is, quote, no longer prepared to accommodate the 7,000 refugees it agreed to accept in negotiations with the European Union, citing security concerns and the possibility of disease epidemics. ISIS has claimed responsibility for 3 airport bombings in Brussels that have killed 31 people. Here with the latest on those attacks and the global reaction is Talk Point's correspondent Josh Carney. Josh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's start with the global reaction. Anytime ISIS claims responsibility for an attack in the West, it's a big deal around the world. So what's been the reaction of countries around the world to this?
It's been complete chaos, rightfully so, because many of these individuals who are suspected are at large. But the big critical concerns are that whether Brussels is able to contain this environment and if the people within that city are still to be remaining safe. There's been a big scare since they've been claiming responsibility for whether it's Paris or throughout the middle of Europe. But the biggest and gravest concern for politicians is, are the people surrounding these cities in the immediate aftermath of the attack immediately safe?
Now, there's been some evidence already that this attack was carried out by the same ISIS cell that carried out the recent Paris attacks back in November. How is this attack similar and different to other terrorist attacks in Europe, including that one and others?
It's similar both in sheer destruction and utter chaos, and the fact that global officials and local officials had the opportunity to get more intel, were aware of certain situations, but were not able to either quickly react, or it became too much of a normalcy, the heightened security alerts, that they weren't as attentive as they should have been. There's a lot of false characterizations, but largely it lies on local officials and the broader majority of people who tackle these issues to be more astute to the problems at hand. The major similarities are that obviously it's the same group carrying it out, and that it is the same version of radicalized individuals in the way that they became radicalized. But the sheer distinctions are that there was a huge gap in local security, and those grave security concerns are forming a huge chasm in both local politics and the global understanding of the issue.
So what's being done right now to respond to the immediate threat, which is, as you said, a lot of these perpetrators are at large, and ISIS is obviously still carrying out attacks in the West. What's being done to respond to that threat?
Well, major authority figures are using this as an attack point where they're able to get more resources and go after this situation and those individuals more aggressively. But ultimately, it's not exactly how these individuals are reacting, but what is the actual plan for their reaction. It seems as if right now, while they are trying to gather as much intel and go through a series of raids throughout the city of Brussels, nobody really knows what the true answers are or the next path towards solving this case. It really comes down to the major security concerns and the huge amount of intel that needs to be gathered. There's a lot that we don't know about the terrorist cells that are evolving within these cities, and the fact that this is a known area where people are becoming radicalized and there is not as much of a security concern before is a huge implication that the Brussels politicians and the media need to be more alert and definitely respond more proactively to such issues and concerns.
Josh Carney, thank you for joining us. Turkey was rocked by its second bombing in a week on March 19th. A suicide bomber detonated a bomb in Istanbul, killing 4 and injuring 36. ISIS claimed responsibility for this attack. Talking Point spoke to Layla Abdulrahman, a Stanford student who was studying in Istanbul, and she said, quote, "There's been tightened security in many popular areas at popular tourist attractions and almost all museums. Your bags will be searched and they will scan you with a metal detector," end quote. Turkey has been criticized recently for state crackdowns on media, and I spoke yesterday to Talking Point's foreign correspondent Nick Papantonis, who was studying in Istanbul, about the Turkish media's coverage.
Already pretty tight here, so there hasn't been any noticeable increase. At the most, we've seen a couple of extra officers in subway stations and the entrances of airports, but in a day-to-day basis on your everyday street here, not much.
As Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is pushing to amend Turkey's constitution to give himself more power, which has caused considerable controversy. Papantonis said that for the moment, at least, that is a secondary issue to Turkey. We'll be right back.
Son, tell him that I've begun to dream of things to come, and tell the trees not to look for me. I'm going to find some peace of mind. Wake the sun. Wake the sun, wake the sun, wake the sun.
The European Union and Turkey recently struck a deal that aims to alleviate the refugee crisis. Here to break it down is Zina Saifi. Zina, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Now, what exactly does the deal entail? What is in the text of this deal about the refugee crisis?
So according to the EU, this is their way of trying to relieve the strains that the refugee crisis has had on the European countries. So basically, starting in April, and this was originally supposed to start last Sunday, but because so many critics said that the deal was made prematurely, they pushed it back to April. So starting that date, every refugee that is illegally entering the borders of Europe is going to be sent back to Turkey. And for each refugee that is sent back, one Syrian refugee will be resettled in Europe. And the EU is going to be giving Turkey around $6 billion to be able to accommodate for this. And in addition to that, their citizens are going to be given visa-free travel into almost all countries of Europe starting during the summer.
And we mentioned in the opening recap that there have been some boycotts of Greek refugee camps because of human rights concerns. So there clearly are some people who have problems with this deal. So talk a little bit about that. What are some problems with it?
So there are a bunch. The first one is that Turkey is suffering from its own security crisis of its own. So that begs the question that are they really prepared to take in this massive amount of refugees? Another thing is that just the refugees are so desperate to get in to be reunited with their family. So it makes people think that are they really going to follow these conditions, or are they just going to try to find another route into Europe? The biggest issue is the hypocrisy behind the deal. So the EU has been cutting these deals with so many countries in the past, such as Morocco and Libya, and it's basically just trying to create a Europe fortress where they're protecting their borders, but they're just outsourcing the problem to non-EU countries. And that basically just solves their domestic issues rather than the larger issue, which is the refugee crisis. And on the side of Turkey, it just presents the president as an indispensable statesman who is just letting all these people into his country when in fact he has an election coming up in November and he just wants to try to make himself seem like a good candidate. In addition to that, it's also going to potentially lead to discussions reopening about the Turkey joining the EU. So that helps both sides on their own, but it doesn't really help the refugee crisis.
Now, after this recent Brussels attack, there have been some concerns about letting more refugees into Europe. So how does that change the optics of the situation of the overall refugee crisis?
Well, European countries from the beginning weren't really open to letting refugees in from the beginning. So they basically have been using Brussels as an excuse to say that we don't want to let these refugees in. Like you mentioned in the beginning of the show, Poland, they completely rejected letting them in. Even in the United States, Ted Cruz announced that Obama's plan of trying to let Syrian refugees in shouldn't be accepted because they might be carrying extremists amongst them. So it basically just reopened the talks that these refugees are violent and they're carrying extremists with them.
Zina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, the latest on President Obama's historic visit to Cuba. Don't go anywhere.
Body language can tell you all sorts of things. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911 and get them to a hospital immediately. Learn the body language and spot a stroke fast.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. But it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket. Again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
This new mom is struggling to get the skates just right. Now she's holding on for dear life.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of siblings in foster care will take you just as you are.
If you see news happening on campus, in Syracuse, or across the nation, call the CitrusTV newsroom 315-443-1177 or tweet at CitrusTV News, your campus news leader.
Time in nearly 90 years, a sitting U.S. president visited the communist island of Cuba. President Obama wrapped up his three-day stay just a few days ago, and we are now joined by Talking Points correspondent Molly Smith to hear how the conversation between the two nations unfolded. Molly, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
So the last president to go to Cuba was Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s. Why change that now?
So we're talking about a history between these two countries that goes back well before our time. And we're going back into the height of the Cold War in the communist era where where Cuba was really under the control of Fidel Castro, and the United States was trying to oppose this regime as best as could. And we're going into seeing, severed ties between the two countries, getting into the Bay of Pigs incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s, really at the worst of these two countries' relations. But, in the past few years, the relations have started to ease a lot. We saw back in December of 2014 when the countries mutually agreed to normalize diplomatic relations and start to re-foster some of those economic and cultural ties. Back in last summer when the countries reopened embassies in both of the other countries' capitals, and recently with commercial flights starting from the U.S. to Cuba again, and really all of this coming to a peak with Obama's visit this week. This was really, as everyone was calling it, an historic visit that Obama was really trying to set the stage as this being very peaceful. He said, quote, "I've come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas and extend a hand of friendship to the Cuban people."
So what were the immediate takeaways from this visit? As far as conversation, what did President Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro, what did they talk about?
Well, the first biggest one, in my opinion at least, was that, the calling for lifting the embargo. So President Obama said, that in some point eventually, did not give a date, but saying eventually to lift the embargo, which is really just a series of embargoes, this grand umbrella term for, this harboring of a relationship between the two countries. So that was the first one. The second, which has been a real hallmark of Obama's presidency as well, is Guantanamo Bay, and that Obama has been trying to, get all the prisoners out of Gitmo. He's recently got it to under 100, but there are still prisoners there, and there are mixed feelings between the two presidents about Gitmo. Castro called for the return of Gitmo to Cuba, and as far as the United States goes, there's really no showing of giving Guantanamo back. And the last one, which Obama really set the stage for this whole visit, was encouraging the Cuban people to embrace change. He's really trying to instill in them this hope for a better future. So that really was the central theme of his visit.
There was a really incredible picture from the visit of Cuban citizens standing outside of their tiny houses watching Air Force One fly overhead, kind of just dwarfing everything on the ground. So what was the Cuban reaction to the President of the United States coming to visit for the first time in so long?
They really welcomed him. I think for the Cuban people, this was like what I just said, this is really what they're referring to as a future of hope. And these people were just so, lifted in their hearts by seeing, having the president come. And like we said, for the first time in nearly 90 years, that a democratic nation is trying to establish ties with the communist country. So this was really a big deal for them, and especially hearing from President Obama preaching for these universal human rights that these Cuban people just can't really understand, freedom of speech and speaking out against their government, things that they are being imprisoned for, and that Obama is not trying to necessarily impose this system on the Cuban people, but encouraging for the Cuban people to really embrace new changes.
Now, these two countries have been at odds with each other for about 50 years or so. Rome wasn't built in a day, and the relations won't be fixed with one visit. So what comes next in terms of relations between the two countries?
So the overall goal here is really to, improve the overall quality of life for the average Cuban person, and that's really what Obama is going for. We're talking about economic prosperity, sustaining and retaining that, and also, he wants these human rights for the people that we take for granted every day, like one of the hallmarks being greater access to the internet. This is something that the Cuban people, which is just starting to become that you'll get Wi-Fi in public places, and he's saying that, in order to promote these changes, to have environmental protections, to have greater access to business and whatnot, you need to have a place where these ideas can take place and you can exchange ideas. So he really is calling for, a future of hope.
Molly Smith, thank you for joining us. Amid its worst recession in 25 years, Brazil is also facing a massive political corruption scandal, causing millions to call for President Rousseff's resignation. Here to explain the political crisis in Brazil is Talking Points correspondent Sarah Nevins. Sarah, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
So Brazil was under a military dictatorship for 20 years that was known for its corruption. Then it shifted into democracy, which is where it's at now. And now there's this scandal, which even by the standards of Brazil's history with corruption, is really corrupt. So what exactly is happening?
So at the center of this scandal is Brazil's only oil company, Petrobras, which is state-owned and accounts for 10% of the country's GDP. To put that in perspective, Apple, our biggest company, only accounts for 0.5% of our GDP. So it's one of the largest companies in the world. Basically, a government investigation found that since 2004, some top Petrobras officials had been working with construction companies to charge the oil company a lot of money for construction and service costs in exchange for lucrative contracts. So the Petrobras employees got massive bribes in return for this, and what's coming out now is that they shared that money with politicians. And so what's most shocking about this is the scale of the bribes. One former Petrobras employee said that he would give back all the money he took in bribes back to the government. That amount of money is $100 million. And so in total, we're looking at around $3 billion of government money in kickbacks.
So this is a pretty far-reaching scandal, too. So just how many different politicians are ensnared in this sort of web of corruption that's going on right now?
So currently, 100 standing congressmen are under investigation. That's about 1/5 of the entire body. There's also been a lot of arrests made of former Petrobras employees and former politicians. Many of the people involved are actually members of the Workers' Party, which is the party of current President Rousseff and also former President Lula da Silva, who is really the political figure in Brazil. He's the one who really led Brazil's transition into democracy.
Now, what you mentioned about President Rousseff and President Lula, that's one of the most interesting parts of this scandal. So talk a little about what role Lula plays in this whole issue.
So earlier this month, police raided Lula's home and questioned his involvement in the scandal because he is also being investigated for a money laundering scheme, which has connected him to the construction companies that are involved with Petrobras. What happened was, a few days after that happened, President Rousseff nominated him as her chief of staff, which would make it very, very difficult for him to be prosecuted. The Supreme Court has since denied that appointment. However, it launched massive protests all around Brazil calling for her resignation. But there's also a lot of protests still showing support for her and Lula because it hasn't been legally proven that they were involved. President Rousseff is currently undergoing impeachment hearings. However, 5 of the people on that committee are under investigation themselves. So a lot of protesters don't think it's fair.
Sarah, thank you for joining us. We'll be right back.
If you want to be a parent, it doesn't matter how you play, what you wear, how you dance, or even what direction life takes you. You just need to be there. You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care don't need perfection. They just need you.
There's a shelter pet who wants to meet you. Meet one today. Visit theshelterpetproject.org. Adopt.
Some good news for Bernie Sanders on Western Tuesday as he won Utah and Idaho. Clinton, meanwhile, picked up Arizona this week and snatched up 5 other states last week. On the Republican side, Trump won Arizona and Ted Cruz won Utah. The Tuesday prior to that, John Kasich took his home state of Ohio, and Donald Trump won 4 states, the most important being Florida because it prompted Marco Rubio to drop out of the race. Although Trump has been winning a lot of states recently, Ted Cruz has been picking up some key endorsements, with former Republican nominee Mitt Romney voting for Cruz in Utah and former candidate Jeb Bush endorsing Cruz earlier this week. With only 19 states to go, the GOP is doing everything they can to avoid a Trump nomination. It seems as though the only way to prevent the nomination is through a brokered convention. Here to talk about how likely that is and how we could get there is Talking Point's election correspondent Dan Prager. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So let's start with talking about a brokered convention. There hasn't been one since the mid-50s. So what would that look like right now?
Well, we don't know exactly if it's going to happen yet, but the magic number is 1,237. That's the number of delegates you need at the Republican National Convention to win round 1 of the convention and not go to this brokered convention. If they reach that number, it's over, they win. However, a brokered convention goes into later rounds, could be as many as 100, which happened back in the 20s, I believe. So in the second round of this brokered convention, the delegates, who are normally tied to the voters in the state they represent, are freed. 57% in the second round are freed to vote for whoever they want. And these people are usually establishment candidates, so they would be more likely to vote for Kasich or Ted Cruz. More likely Kasich, but if Cruz has more voters, in that case, in the third round, 81% are freed, and so on and so forth until they have a nominee.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the longest convention balloting in history was 103 ballots with the 24 Democratic convention, which was pretty fascinating. But what's each candidate's strategy looking like right now? Because Donald Trump is very close, Ted Cruz is on his heels, and John Kasich is really in the race because he won Ohio. So what are each of them looking to do leading up to this possible brokered convention?
Well, like you said, Trump is close. He has 741 delegates right now. His plan is hold that lead and win. A convention would not go well for him. He is not likely to win in a brokered convention unless he is incredibly close to that magic number. Ted Cruz, on the other hand, is really looking for get as many voters away from Trump as possible. But he also has to worry about John Kasich. Even though there's a big gap between the two of them, these establishment delegates could vote for Kasich over Cruz because he's not well liked among the establishment crowd. So he really has to prove that he is the guy. He is the only non-Trump candidate. Whereas Kasich, his plan, just get votes. He only has won 1 state, Ohio, and the rules of the Republican National Convention, although they do change around a bit. Say you need to win 8 states to be eligible for that nomination. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but it probably will. So he really has to take those northeastern states and show that he has enough voters and enough support that he can justify winning to these delegates.
So in our final 30 seconds, political junkies like us, we salivated the thought of a brokered convention and being glued to CNN watching it. But just how likely is it to happen?
Well, it's becoming more and more likely right now. Trump needs 55% of the voters to win, and we're not sure if that's going to happen. Every time Cruz wins a state, it becomes much less likely. But really, if it does happen, it's going to be because Cruz and Kasich work together, and Kasich takes the northeastern states, and Cruz takes the western states. They stay out of each other's hair. But the real issue here is, if it does happen, there's going to be chaos. Trump has said if he doesn't win, there will be riots. And Cleveland is preparing for this. 2,000 riot suits that they've bought in order to prevent this from happening. They're really preparing for the worst.
Dan Prager, thank you for joining us. After the break, LGBT rights are under attack after North Carolina lawmakers pass and sign a new bill. Stay with us.
How you doing? My name's Steve. My family's lived in this neighborhood for years. Recently, things got so tight, we had to go to our local food bank for help. I lost a lot of sleep worrying about what the neighbors might think. That is until I saw them there, too. How'd I do, Steve?
A little stiff. You could have done a little better.
What? Come on. You know, I have an Academy Award.
Yeah, but not for playing me.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
North Carolina passed a law yesterday banning cities from protecting LGBT rights. Talking Points correspondent Topher Lane is here to break it all down. Topher?
North Carolina signed HB 2 yesterday, a bill blocking cities and counties from allowing LGBT protections to be put into place. The bill comes on the heels of Charlotte passing a measure that protected LGBT people as a class and enabled them to use the facilities of the gender that they identified with. HB 2, or the Public Facilities and Privacy and Security Act, prevents transgendered people from using the facilities of the gender that they identify with and removes the Charlotte ordinances that protect LGBT people. With this law, businesses can discriminate against LGBT as a class. Chris Sgro, director of Equality NC, had this to say before the bill was signed by Governor Pat McCrory yesterday.
We are about to pass the most sweeping anti-LGBT bill in the nation. And that is a disaster, and Governor McCrory must stand up and veto that like other Republicans have in other states, because we just do not know the depth of the unintended consequences of this.
Opposition to the bill has been referring to it as, quote, the most anti-LGBT legislation in the country. Meanwhile, Governor McCrory has defended the bill, saying it, quote, defied common sense, allowing men to use women's bathrooms and locker rooms. The vote itself saw Democrats leave in the state Senate before the vote was actually held. This was in protest, as Senate Democrats felt as though their voices weren't being heard. In addition to this, the bill was given to the representatives in the State House just 5 minutes before they were to take the vote. The bill had several more restrictions than initially expected, as it was previously thought to exclusively deal with the bathrooms. Instead, the prevention of measures against discrimination in the workplace and the ban on any city laws changing this were also included. The state of Georgia is also considering a law that goes a step further than HB 2. The Free Exercise Protection Act would offer protections to businesses that refuse to provide services that violate their beliefs. The law would pave an avenue for more religious freedom acts that enable discrimination. Georgia Governor Nathan Deal has until May 3rd to decide whether to veto the bill, which has already passed in the state Senate and House. Disney, the NFL, and Marvel have stated that they will boycott working in the state of Georgia if the said bill is signed into law. The NFL has threatened to pull consideration of Atlanta for the Super Bowl in 2019 or 2020. Alex, back to you.
Thanks, Topher. Talking Points has been gone for 2 weeks, and here's what happened around the United States during that time. SeaWorld announced last Thursday that they are phasing out their orca program and ending an in-park breeding of killer whales. Various animal rights activists have been protesting for SeaWorld to release their killer whales after the documentary Blackfish exposed cruel treatment of the animals at the hands of the company. Last week, President Obama announced Merrick Garland as his nominee for the vacant Supreme Court position. Republicans in Washington have stated that they will not hold a hearing for Garland and will wait to approve a Supreme Court nomination only after the next president is elected and sworn into office, regardless of their party. Last week, North Korea sentenced a University of Virginia student, Otto Frederick Warmbier, to 15 years of hard labor. North Korean officials accuse Warmbier of removing a political banner from a hotel balcony. President Obama and other United States officials are urging North Korea to release Warmbier, saying that the sentence is, quote, unduly harsh and does not fit the crime. The former controversial Mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, has died from cancer. Mayor Ford was known for his scandalous behavior such as public intoxication and drug use when he served his term as mayor from 2010 until 2014. Ford leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. That's all the time we have for Talking Points this evening. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to check out Citrus TV News on Twitter and Facebook, as well as all of our content on YouTube. For Talking Points, I'm Alex Amico, and happy National Orange Day, Syracuse.